Willow Creek, a town veiled in perpetual twilight, shrouded in secrets as deep as the ancient woods that encircled it. John Harper, his wife, Amelia, and their 2 children, 17-year-old Jessica and 9-year-old Sam, were oblivious to the town's sinister whispers. They were city dwellers, seeking refuge from the clamour and chaos of urban life. Willow Creek, with its quaint charm and promise of tranquility, seemed like the perfect sanctuary. Little did they know they were driving headfirst into a maelstrom of fear. With each passing mile, a sense of unease settled over John. The house loomed before them, a Victorian mansion perched atop a hill overlooking Willow Creek. Its gables cut sharp silhouettes against the darkening sky, and its windows, like vacant eyes, stared out at them with an unnerving intensity. John parked the car in the overgrown driveway, the crunch of gravel loud in the stillness. The children, weary from the long drive, tumbled out of the car, their initial excitement overshadowed by the imposing presence of the house. As they approached the front porch, the floorboards groaned in protest, as if disturbed from a long sleep. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, arranging furniture and exploring their new surroundings. John, determined to make the best of their new life, threw himself into the task of restoring the house to its former glory. Amelia focused on creating a sense of warmth and normalcy for their children. Jessica retreated into the digital world, her phone her lifeline to the familiar and the comforting. Sam, however, remained captivated by the house. Despite their efforts, an undercurrent of tension ran through the family. Footsteps echoed in the dead of night, disembodied whispers seemed to emanate from the walls. One cool evening, while leafing through a local history book, John stumbled upon a faded photograph of their house. The caption read, "The Harbinger House, 1888, site of the tragic demise of the Vanderlyn family." His blood ran cold. The book spoke of Elias Vanderlyn, a wealthy industrialist, his wife Eleanor and their 2 children. The family had met a grisly end within the walls of their home. John closed the book, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake off the feeling that their fate was somehow intertwined with his own. Days turned into weeks, and the unsettling events at Harbinger House continued. One afternoon, young Sam sat in the middle of his room, his brow furrowed in concentration as he played with a toy train. Suddenly the train screeched to a halt, its wheels spinning uselessly. The toy train, as if possessed by an unseen force, shot across the room, smashing against the wall with a sickening crunch. Sam stared at the broken toy, his eyes wide with fear. That night, as John lay in bed, unable to shake off the image of the broken toy, he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the walls. He sat up, straining to listen. Just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard it again. A voice, soft and low, like a breath against his ear, whispering his name. John's eyes flew open, his heart pounding against his ribs. Amelia, ever the pragmatist, tried to rationalize the strange occurrences. One afternoon, while dusting the living room, she felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to emanate from a specific spot near the fireplace. She slowly withdrew her hand, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had heard tales of cold spots, areas where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. But standing there, in the suffocating cold, she couldn't help but question everything she thought she knew. As the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, the strange occurrences at Harbinger House intensified. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, a frigid gust of wind swept through the dining room, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. The curtains billowed violently, as if an unseen hand had torn them open. Jessica, her face pale with fear, clutched at her throat, gasping for breath. John, his heart pounding in his chest, jumped up from his seat, his eyes scanning the room for the source of the draught. But the windows were closed, the doors were locked. The family tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the escalating events were taking a toll. One morning, John noticed something amiss. The family portrait, a cherished photograph taken just before their move to Willow Creek, was missing from the mantelpiece. He searched the living room, his frustration mounting with each passing moment. He distinctly remembered placing the photograph on the mantelpiece. A wave of unease washed over him, the chilling realization that someone or something was toying with them. That night, Jessica lay in bed, her body trembling beneath the weight of her fear. She longed for the comfort of her old life, her old friends, her old bedroom. She felt a cold draft like an unseen hand brush against her cheek. Her eyes flew open, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt it again, this time a distinct pressure on her arm, like icy fingers digging into her skin. Terror, raw and consuming, paralyzed her, rooting her to the spot. The old grand piano in the parlour had been silent since their arrival. Yet one evening, as the family sat in tense silence, a melody filled the air. It started softly, a single note, hesitant, like fingers rediscovering a forgotten skill. Then a chord, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. The melody grew in complexity, a mournful waltz, its rhythm both enticing and terrifying. The music stopped abruptly, leaving an echoing silence in its wake. Jessica, desperate for a connection to the outside world, clung to her phone. The signal in Willow Creek notoriously unreliable. One afternoon, as she tried to call a friend, the line crackled with static. Through the white noise, a voice, distorted and chillingly familiar, whispered her name. "Jessica," it hissed, the voice laced with malice and something else. "Longing? We're here. With you." The phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. It was one thing to hear whispers in the dead of night, another entirely to have a voice, cold and disembodied, invade the supposed safety of a phone call. John, a man of logic and reason, found his sanity slowly unraveling. He tried to rationalize the events, to find logical explanations for the unexplainable. But the house, with its insidious whispers and chilling occurrences, was slowly chipping away at his resolve. One night, as he lay in bed, his mind racing, he saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, slithered across the wall. It took on a vaguely humanoid form, tall and skeletal, its edges flickering like flames. It had no discernible features, only a void where its face should be. He wanted to scream, to bolt from the bed, to wake Amelia, but fear, cold and paralyzing, held him captive. The shadow lingered for a moment, its presence suffocating, then dissipated into the darkness, leaving a chill in its wake that seemed to seep into John's very bones. Sleep, once a refuge, became another source of terror. Each night the family was plagued by vivid nightmares, their subconscious minds reflecting the horrors that permeated their waking hours. They dreamt of cold whispers, unseen hands, and the chilling presence that watched their every move. One night Sam woke up screaming, his small body drenched in sweat. He thrashed about in his bed, his cries echoing through the silent house. Amelia rushed to his side, gathering him in her arms, his small body trembling against hers. "Mummy," he whimpered, his voice thick with terror. "The shadow man, he was in my dream. He said he wants to take us away." Amelia's blood ran cold. It was one thing for them to experience these horrors, but to have their innocent child tormented as well was unbearable. The tension in the house was palpable, a suffocating presence that hung heavy in the air. Even the simplest tasks like preparing a meal or reading a book were fraught with a sense of unease. The family was trapped, their dream home transformed into a prison of fear. One morning, Amelia discovered something chilling in the hallway. Scrawled across the pristine wallpaper in what appeared to be charcoal were 3 words: "Get out now." The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, as if written in haste under duress. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't a prank. This was a warning. But from whom or what? And could they escape even if they wanted to? The house had them in its grip, and it seemed determined to never let go. Driven to desperation, Amelia contacted Mrs. Hawthorne, a local woman whispered to be well versed in matters of the unseen world. Mrs. Hawthorne, a wizened woman with eyes that held ancient knowledge, agreed to come to Harbinger House. That night, with the curtains drawn and candles flickering, they sat around the old dining table, their faces drawn and pale in the dim light. Mrs. Hawthorne, her voice a low thrum, guided them through the ritual, her fingers tracing patterns in the air. The air grew heavy, the temperature plummeting. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Then a voice, cold and hollow, filled the room. "You are trespassing," it hissed, the voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Leave now or face the consequences." The voice faded, leaving behind a silence thick with menace. Fear, raw and consuming, gripped the Harpers. They were trapped at the mercy of an entity they didn't understand, an entity that clearly wanted them gone. The aftermath of the séance left the family shaken. The entity's voice, laced with malice and power, resonated in their ears. They were unwelcome guests in Harbinger House. Mrs. Hawthorne advised them to leave. However, leaving wasn't an option for the Harpers. They had poured their savings into this house, a cleansing ritual, an ancient rite to banish malevolent forces. Hope, fragile and flickering, ignited in their hearts. The ritual, Mrs. Hawthorne explained, had to be performed during the witching hour. They needed specific herbs, candles, and a personal item from each family member. The air crackled with tension as they gathered in the living room. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the lone candle. John, his hands shaking, lit the incense. Amelia read aloud the incantation from a weathered book. Jessica and Sam watched as Mrs. Hawthorne chanted. The temperature dropped, a bone-chilling cold seeping into the room. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The single candle sputtered, its flame shrinking. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. It was Jessica. She was pointing a trembling finger at the corner of the room. "It's there!" she shrieked. A dark form began to coalesce in the corner where Jessica pointed, a swirling vortex of shadows and malevolent energy. It writhed and pulsated, growing larger with each passing moment, its presence radiating an icy cold that chilled them to the bone. The temperature plummeted further, frost forming on the windows as the air crackled with static electricity. John, his voice tight with fear, continued to read the incantation, his eyes fixed on the writhing darkness. Amelia, her face pale but determined, placed her hand over his, lending him her strength. Mrs. Hawthorne, her eyes blazing with an inner fire, raised her arms, her voice rising in a powerful chant, challenging the entity, daring it to show itself. A low growl, guttural and filled with rage, emanated from the darkness. Objects in the room began to tremble, vibrating with an unseen force. The piano in the parlour, silent until now, erupted in a cacophony of discordant notes, its keys moving with impossible speed. The entity, its power growing, was fighting back, unwilling to relinquish its hold on Harbinger House. The lights flickered violently, plunging them into momentary darkness, then surged back to life, brighter than before, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. A deafening roar shook the house, rattling the windows in their frames, threatening to shatter the very foundation of their sanctuary. Panic seized the family. "It's no use!" shouted John, his voice barely audible above the din. "The ritual isn't working!" The entity, its form now almost completely solid, advanced towards them, tendrils of darkness reaching out like grasping claws. Mrs. Hawthorne, her face creased with concern, grabbed Amelia's arm. "We have to get out of here now!" she yelled, her voice urgent. But it was too late. The door slammed shut with a resounding boom, the sound echoing through the house like a death knell. The windows, as if sealed by an unseen force, refused to budge. They were trapped, caged within their own home, at the mercy of a malevolent entity that seemed hell-bent on their destruction. Terror lent them a burst of frantic energy. They scrambled back, seeking refuge, a way out. Their eyes darted around the room, desperate, seeking an escape from the relentless advance of the entity. Mrs. Hawthorne, her voice strained but steady, directed them. "The attic!" she cried, pointing towards the ceiling. "There might be another way out." John, scooping Sam into his arms, raced towards the attic door, his heart pounding against his ribs. Amelia, her hand clasped tightly in Jessica's, followed closely behind. The air grew colder, thick with the stench of decay and something else, something ancient and evil that sent shivers down their spines. They stumbled through the darkened attic, their way illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. They could hear the entity behind them, its heavy footsteps shaking the floorboards, its ragged breathing echoing their own terror. They reached a small, dusty room at the far end of the attic, its door slightly ajar. John, his breath ragged, pushed the door open, ushering his family inside. The room was small and cramped, filled with discarded furniture and forgotten toys, remnants of a happier time. He slammed the door shut, his back pressed against the rough wood, his chest heaving. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It was Jessica. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with horror, staring at the far wall. John spun around, his heart sinking. There, hovering in the dim light, was the entity. Its form, no longer a swirling mass of darkness, had solidified. It was a grotesque mockery of a human, its skin stretched taut over a skeletal frame, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The entity grinned, a chilling, humorless expression that sent shivers down their spines. "You cannot hide," it hissed, its voice a raspy whisper that seemed to claw at their sanity. "This house is mine. And now," it added, its grin widening, "so are you." The attic room, once a repository for forgotten memories, became a battleground for their lives. The air crackled with a palpable tension, the stench of decay mingling with the metallic tang of fear. The entity, its form grotesquely solidified, blocked the only exit, its shadow swallowing the room in a suffocating embrace. John, his arms wrapped protectively around Sam and Jessica, felt a surge of desperate courage. He had to protect his children, even if it meant facing this nightmare head-on. He shoved a dusty rocking chair towards the entity, a meagre attempt to buy them some time. The entity, however, merely chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that echoed the emptiness in its eyes. "Foolish mortal!" it hissed, its voice a chilling whisper that seemed to slither around them like venomous snakes. "Do you think you can fight what you cannot understand?" The rocking chair, as if controlled by an invisible hand, reversed course, slamming against John's legs, sending him crashing to the floor. Amelia screamed, scrambling to John's side, her heart pounding against her ribs. But it was Sam, his small frame trembling with a courage that surprised even him, who stepped forward. "Leave them alone!" he shouted, his voice high-pitched but filled with a defiance that echoed in the cramped room. The entity turned its ghastly gaze upon the young boy, its grin widening into a grotesque mockery of amusement. "And what will you do, little one?" it taunted, its voice dripping with condescension. "Face me with your toys and your tears?" It leaned down, its skeletal hand reaching out as if to snatch Sam away. But Sam, instead of cowering, held his ground. He closed his eyes, his small hand clenching into a fist. "You're not scary," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "You're just sad and lonely." The entity froze, its hand hovering in mid-air. A look of confusion, almost pain, flickered across its grotesque features. Mrs. Hawthorne, witnessing this unexpected turn of events, stepped forward. She placed a reassuring hand on Sam's shoulder, her voice calm and steady. "The boy is right," she said, addressing the entity. "You are not what you seem. You are trapped, bound to this house by your pain and anger." She paused, her eyes searching the entity's face. "Elias," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. The name, spoken aloud for the first time in over a century, seemed to crack the entity's facade. Its form wavered, the malevolent energy flickering like a dying flame. "Who speaks that name?" it roared, its voice a tortured growl that shook the very foundation of the house. "I know your story, Elias," Mrs. Hawthorne continued, her voice unwavering. "I know the tragedy that befell you and your family within these very walls. But your anger, your need for revenge, it's only hurting you, keeping you tethered to this place." The entity, its form shifting between monstrous and almost human, swayed, its glowing eyes filled with a torment that transcended the physical. "They took everything from me," it hissed, its voice raspy with anguish. "My wife, my children, my life, all ripped away in a single night of fire and betrayal." The room grew colder, the air thick with the weight of the entity's sorrow and rage. John, Amelia and Jessica listened, their own fear momentarily forgotten as they bore witness to a grief so profound it echoed through the ages. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded, her expression filled with empathy. "You were betrayed, Elias," she acknowledged. "But by clinging to your anger, you're only perpetuating the cycle of pain." "I cannot let go," the entity moaned, its voice barely audible. "The pain, the guilt, it consumes me." It turned its tortured gaze upon the Harpers, a flicker of regret crossing its grotesque features. "I did not mean to harm you," it whispered. "You are simply caught in the crossfire of my despair." Amelia, her heart aching with a mother's understanding, stepped forward. "We may not know the depths of your pain, Elias," she said, her voice soft yet firm, "but we know loss. We know the pain of a broken heart." She glanced at her children, their faces pale but filled with a newfound understanding. "Your wife, your children," Amelia continued, her eyes meeting the entity's. "They wouldn't want this for you. They wouldn't want you to be trapped in this prison of your own making. Let go, Elias, let them go. Find peace." The entity recoiled as if struck. The rage, the despair that had fueled its existence for over a century seemed to dissipate, replaced by a flicker of hope, a longing for release. But years of anger and resentment don't fade easily. It snarled, its form flickering wildly, its voice a tortured rasp. "It's not that simple," it roared, its anger echoing through the house. "The fire still burns within me." Suddenly the room was engulfed in blinding light. Sam, clutching his teddy bear, stumbled back, shielding his eyes. A shimmering portal opened, swirling with colours unseen in the natural world. 3 figures stood at the threshold, bathed in ethereal light. A kind man held out his hand. He stepped into the light, joining his family as the portal closed. Silence descended upon the attic room, heavy and absolute. The air, moments ago thick with malevolent energy, now felt cleansed, almost sweet. The only sound was the gentle creak of the old house. John, Amelia, Jessica and Sam stood frozen, their faces pale. The teddy bear slipped from Sam's grasp, landing with a soft thud. He looked down at it, then back at the spot where the portal had shimmered. A single tear rolled down his cheek, a tear of profound sadness. The monster had become a lost soul, finally finding peace. John, his legs shaky, lowered himself to the floor, his back against the wall. He pulled Amelia and Jessica down with him, gathering them in a tight embrace. The weight of what they had experienced pressed down on them. Mrs. Hawthorne handed Sam's teddy bear back to him, a comforting gesture. "It's over now," she said, her voice raspy but soothing. "They're free." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled, a rare and beautiful sight on her weathered face. "Sometimes," she said, "the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with understanding and compassion." She looked around the attic room, her gaze lingering on the dust-covered toys and faded photographs. Elias and his family were trapped here, bound by their pain, their anger. But your courage helped them find peace, to move on. The first rays of dawn peeked through the grimy attic window. The Harpers, their faces still pale, but their eyes reflecting the burgeoning light, rose to their feet. They left Willow Creek the next day. The moving truck rumbled down the dusty road, leaving Harbinger House behind. No tearful goodbyes, no lingering glances back. They were leaving behind a chapter filled with terror and unexpected grace. Willow Creek, shrouded in morning mist, receded in the rearview mirror. John glanced at Amelia, her hand resting lightly on his. He saw exhaustion, fear, and newfound strength in her eyes. Jessica, with headphones on, stared out the window, her gaze distant. Sometimes the bravest thing is to face your fears and emerge into the light. As they drove towards the rising sun, they carried the knowledge that some bonds can never be broken. The Harpers rebuilt their lives, brick by fragile brick, on the foundation of their shared trauma. They didn't speak much of Willow Creek or the entity that haunted their lives. The experience lingered, a chilling ghost story they carried within. John became withdrawn, haunted by the memory of the entity's tortured face. He found solace in the concrete world of numbers and spreadsheets. Amelia focused on her family, creating a haven of normalcy. Jessica retreated into books on the paranormal, seeking answers. Sam, the youngest, rarely spoke of the Shadow Man. In quiet moments he clutched his teddy bear and whispered a silent prayer for the lost family of Harbinger House. He hoped they had found peace, their laughter now filling a brighter place. The Harbinger House stood as a brooding sentinel, a reminder of the darkness beneath Willow Creek's facade. Locals whispered tales of the family who fled in terror, their stories a chilling testament to unseen forces. Life went on. But the Harpers carried the scars of Willow Creek, invisible wounds that ached in the silence of the night. They learned that some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed. John couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. He would wake in the dead of night, heart-pounding cold whispers clinging to his dreams. Amelia found solace in her faith, believing love could triumph over darkness. And what of the Harbinger house? It stood silent and watchful, on the hill overlooking Willow Creek, a monument to tragedy and a testament to the enduring power of fear. Was it truly empty, finally at peace after a century of torment? Or did something still linger within its walls, a whisper of darkness, a flicker of cold energy, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold? Some questions, the Harpers knew, were best left unanswered. Some doors, once closed, were better left unopened. For in the shadowy corners of the world, in the spaces between belief and disbelief, where reason gives way to the primal fear that binds us all, there are things that defy explanation, that mock our understanding, and that remind us with chilling certainty that we are not alone.